All right. Well, then let's get rolling. Good evening, friends. So this webinar was pulled together between Marie and I. We were actually going to do it at NACAC. All four of us were all on board to do it at NACAC before the world crashed. So we figured we might as well just roll it and do it Zoom like all the things in the world. So hopefully today what we'll have is a nice conversation around interacting with the media, how stories are developed, how educators can get our stories into the world and make positive change that we're looking to make. So that's really sort of the thought process that went into suggesting this for NACAC and then deciding to do it online. So what we'll start with is each of us are going to go around, introduce ourselves, maybe bring up a point or three that we think are important to this conversation, and then we'll launch into some questions, whether questions from you or questions we've pre-prepared. We'll see how that goes, and we'll go from there. So I'll start off. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Akil Bello. I'm currently the Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at FairTest. I have been in the college access test preparation space for going on 30 years now. I started as a test prep tutor in 1990, ran my own company for a little bit, and now I'm at FairTest. And as I like to say, my full-time job is trying to make my more lucrative part-time job go away. And over the course of all these years, I've been in a paper or two, I've been in a story or two, I was in a documentary. And one of the interesting things to me in terms of the media and education is how these stories are developed, how people end up in the stories, and what the stories ultimately look like after you've had conversations with reporters. And I think that's part of the whole conversation I kind of wanted to bring up a few points around. One is I think social media has been huge. It's given me access. The number of education reporters who follow me on Twitter is fascinating. Many of them I've talked to, some of them I haven't. I have DMs from time to time with reporters around stories. Sometimes it's just for them asking me for clarifying points. So I think one of the big parts of this is to recognize that reporters are often looking for information. And one of the things that make that relationship with journalists more thoughtful, more useful, more fruitful is being a source of information, right? And the more you are a source of information, the more you become helpful to them, and therefore that could potentially be helpful to you if you think the media could be helpful to you. And I look at the media in sort of two ways, right? One is getting stories out there that need to be out there. In the description, we talked about Eric's Nepal story. I thought that was huge. I thought that getting that story out there was really big. Getting out the story of what's the other one? Verification, right? So I think being part of the conversation to get those stories out there is key. And you never know where these things are going to go. So the last thing I'll sort of leave you with is those of you who know I was in that documentary, The Test and the Art of Thinking. I ended up in that documentary because they previously interviewed John Katzman. John Katzman sent them to James Murphy. James Murphy sent them to me. And I sent them to all the other Black folks in that movie except one. So part of this whole thing is connections and networking and who you're going to pass the mic to. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation to consider is journalists are often looking for who that next source is, who should they talk to in this conversation. It's useful, it's helpful for you as educators, as somebody who has a story to tell, to one, make yourself available, whether that's TikTok or whatever media we're using these days, or whether that's through your connections with others and letting people know, I will talk to reporters, I'm ready to be a source, I'm helpful, I'm going to respond when someone says, hey, this dude has a story and he's got to turn it around in 24 hours, you got to be able to respond to that, right? There's some people I never actually refer to reporters because I know their job won't let them respond. So I think it's important to think about kind of how those connections work and making yourself known to the people who are going to tell these stories. So I'll stop there and I'll pass the mic to, let's go Marie next, as she's next on my list. And Marie.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Like Akil said, he and I have been talking about this for a long time. And just getting this group together to talk about, how you work with media. So I'm Marie Bigham, she, her, I'm here in New Orleans, and I'm the founder and leader of Accept. Before that, though, I spent 24 years in the admissions profession. But before that, I think most important for this conversation is all of my professional experiences prior to admissions involved working with media, whether that was when I worked on political campaigns, as young as age 15, to working with the St. Louis Rams, their first season in St. Louis. I love saying this because it's just such a cognitive dissonance. I was a women's studies major in college, and I was the manager of the cheerleaders the first season they were in town. And so I taught the cheerleaders like how we're going to work with media. It ended up being a really great experience. And then I worked for one of the nation's biggest PR firms, Fleischman Hillard. So 5 years before doing admissions, I really focused on working with media, and it was something that I always loved, but also found really interesting when I worked in admissions that we weren't out front, we weren't telling our story, we weren't leaving the message. And so when it became possible for me to do so, that was something that I found really important to do. 3 hints that I think we'll talk about later. And also, by the way, not only will we put this onto YouTube, but I'll put together resources from the conversation and email that to everyone as well. So we'll put all those fun things in there. And if cocktail recipes happen to pop up, so be it. 3 points that I wanted to make. If you are going to talk with journalists, if they reach out to you, if you feel like there's a story to tell that involves your work at all, it's really important that you talk with your institution first. It's interesting and it's fun sometimes to get out there, but they could have very, very different rules and limitations, and you don't want to find out too late, because then that really hurts potentially the relationship that you're trying to build with that journalist. Second, develop message points, get comfortable with them, figure out how to pivot to them, figure out how to change questions to meet those message points, but find them and hone them well, practice them, get very comfortable with that coming out of your mouth. I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but unfortunately we're living in a time. Don't lie. Don't lie. Stay in your lane. If you don't know something, you don't know it. They're going to fact check you. It's going to really suck when they come back and say, did you really mean this? Just don't. It's in a moment when you feel like you have this pressure of expertise, it's sometimes this pressure like, I should say something. Your integrity is way more important at that moment. And my 4th point, those of us who consume media need to pay for it. We really need to pay for it. And those of us who continually work with journalists, we need to pay for that too. I started to really think about this a lot when music became free. My brother's a professional musician. I was like, that's intellectual property. Like that's that just seems wrong, right? But I think too often we get so accustomed to, I don't want to look behind a paywall and people grumble about that. But the bottom line is it's really expensive to have great journalism. And we as a culture lose out tremendously without it. And I'm currently living in a city that doesn't have a daily newspaper, and we feel it. So my last point is, y'all, we gotta get comfortable paying for this stuff.
Let's go to Chris.
Hi all, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. I'm Chris Quintana. I'm with USA Today, but this is just the most recent reporting hat that I've worn kind of since I've been started in 2012. I thought it would be useful if I just kind of talked about the variety of roles that I've played as a reporter in covering higher education, just to give you a sense of kind of how widely the coverage will vary from like reporter to reporter, outlet to outlet, and kind of within those outlets themselves. So I first started covering higher education at the Albuquerque Journal in New Mexico. I covered the University of New Mexico, and while I was there, it was very much like a local beat coverage. It was like a local entity. I treated it like a government body. I talked to regents, I talked to the president, I talked with faculty members and students, but I did it in kind of a way where it's like I was seeing them every day. And it was I tried to be on campus as often as I could. And my coverage was hyper specific to kind of the city of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, and a little less so on kind of what was happening nationally. But after that, I got hired at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I my feed had to expand. I was, now writing for an audience who, was way more familiar with the subject material than I was. And we were also, was writing for an audience that was more academic. And so naturally what I ended up writing about changed as well, kind of coming from the local market. I was able to go a little bit more specific and more detailed in some of the issues of the academy that I wouldn't have been able to do at the Albuquerque Journal, kind of talking about, what's the deal with scholarships for families making more than $60,000 a year? Or, what's the implication of a $1.8 billion gift to Johns Hopkins, right? So those aren't things that I would have written about kind of from a local perspective, or maybe even necessarily in the same way from my current role. But I really was able to go kind of deep in the issues in that role as working with the Chronicle, and I'm sure Eric can speak more eloquently to that than I can. But and in my current role with USA Today, we had the newspaper hadn't had a dedicated higher education reporter prior to me being hired on the beats for a little while. And so it's been a little bit of a situation where I'm charting my own path there, but the paper itself tends to be more focused on kind of the consumer journalism has kind of like a weird connotation to it, but we are focused heavily on kind of the students and family perspective of what does it mean to, where do you decide to go to college? How do you pay for it? And so, we may end up explaining things that perhaps we wouldn't have, or I wouldn't have at the Chronicle or at the Albuquerque Journal. I remember a couple of the pieces that I've done takeouts on, I wrote like 1,200 words on the expected family contribution and whether you should worry about that or not. And kind of I wrote a story once about kind of spotting the difference between for-profit universities and nonprofits, privates, and kind of, very stuff that I think perhaps we might take for granted in this sphere, but is less familiar to people who are first-generation students or haven't been to college in a while. So I would say when you're thinking about like talking to the media, you have to be cognizant of who their audience is and kind of like what beats they end up covering within the sector. I mean, I would say that, even at USA Today, like I don't cover all things higher education. Obviously that there isn't enough time to write about athletics, even though that's like a huge part of the college experience. But if I was doing that, I would just be in a completely different desk. But it's in smaller things too, where you would have to do your research to kind of like realize that, oh, maybe this pitch is not going to resonate with this reporter and I should reach out to someone else. Like I, for example, don't end up writing a lot about kind of the admissions debate as it relates to like, Harvard, because that went up to that's expected to go to the Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court reporter who has seniority kind of gets to claim that case over me. So, it's not to say that I wouldn't be interested in that pitch, but just to say like, oh, in this one particular case, I'm not the person who's going to be handling it, even though I handle higher education generally for the paper itself. And it's a little trickier with the Gannett properties because, there's USA Today, the big kind of national publication, but we also have reporters across the country. The big ones that come to mind are, Arizona Republic, Detroit Free Press, Milwaukee Sentinel Journal. These are all papers that, they may report on something kind of locally, but then I may spot it and kind of try to nationalize it at the same time. So knowing kind of like where your reporter's reach is, I think is also useful as far as that goes. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But just to say that, there's a lot of ground for reporters, and I'm definitely receptive to pitches. I just, it helps to remember the audience.
Mr. Hoover, it's on you.
Thank you, Akil. Akil and Marie, thank you for having me. And Chris, I'm glad to be here with you. It's really good to hear your voice and see your face. as Chris mentioned, he worked at the Chronicle previously, prior to his adventure at USA Today, and we in the newsroom at the Chronicle, scattered though it is, we remain fans of Chris, and we miss him. He's seriously, I'm just a little older than he is, so it's the only way in which I don't want to sound like his uncle, but he's an uncommonly thoughtful reporter, and so I'm glad to share some pixel space with him here tonight. So good to see you, Chris. And so I'm Eric, and the Chronicle, where I've worked for 19 years, is a strange kind of hodgepodge of a publication, and I like to think on good days or good weeks, we bring kind of this multifaceted identity to bear. And when I started the Chronicle, and for many years thereafter, our website was, it's no secret, it was just kind of this afterthought. It was this thing that we dealt with, well into the early 2000s, is kind of this thing on the side that we tended to in many ways once we had finished the weekly print publication. And many people did hard work writing stories for the website, but it was for far too long kind of this sidecar, and the Chronicle print publication was the puttering old smoky motorcycle. And I mention that just because papers evolve, newspapers and magazines and websites evolve in various ways, and I like to think, and I do believe that the Chronicle has evolved considerably and continues to do so, though I think we have some challenges and shortcomings, and I'm happy to talk about those. But a long way of saying, even in a relatively small newsroom like ours, all we cover is higher ed. Chris works at a large newspaper that covers like the whole world, A to Z, and he writes about higher education. But he has colleagues that write about the economy and labor and cars and sports and health and medicine. And, the Chronicle, we just cover higher ed. That's it, right? That's all. But as pretty much I would assume anyone tuning in tonight knows, higher ed is so vast, and we cover it in all kinds of different ways. And since I'm the lone person here from the Chronicle, I'll just say a little bit about my job and how it's evolved and where it is now. I mean, yes, I write about college admissions, I write about enrollment issues, but I would say my favorite fact or facet of the whole deal is that I also write about this threshold, this kind of in-between space between high school and college, and students who are on often a long and winding path from one place to another. We can call that the recruitment process. We can call that the admissions process. We can call that college access portal, whatever. I just really like that because there's a lot going on there. There are many stakeholders on the high school side, on the community side, and then, on the college side. And then there's the most important person of all, right? And that is the student, the applicant, the young person moving from one part of life to another. And, yes, I write nerdy enrollment stories sometimes about like how 3 different colleges met their net tuition goals or not, and the often convoluted nitty-gritty, explanation for how those 3 institutions fared. And I think those stories are important, and I will not knock them. But now and then I get to write, I have the opportunity to write stories that I think are first and foremost human, or at least that is the intention, to get at the complexity of students' experiences as they're moving from home to college, whatever college might be. Is that a 4-year residential campus? Is that a 2-year institution? Is that something else? Is that destination something else after high school? And I think the most rewarding stories I've done, often with the help of, yes, admissions officers, admissions deans, enrollment folks, but in particular and largely people who are helping students on the other side of the desk, as people often call it, college counselors, school counselors, college access advisors, anyone who fits that kind of general description, who's able to connect me with students' families, figuring out, how do we do this? Do we want to do this? How are we going to pay for this? Is this terrifying? Is this fraught? What are the challenges and roadblocks and obstacles we're going to face along the way? And so, yes, the Chronicle has its nerdy moments still, and I probably contribute to some of them. But I think when I started, I used to tell people like, hey, I got hired by this national publication you've probably never heard of. And it's really kind of dry. But you know what? Higher education is really important. So that's what I would kind of like run with. And I think I came to see that higher education was not so dry and boring at all, though I might have initially thought of it that way, and that the Chronicle has become much more of a dynamic and I think colorful publication, at least at its best moments and its best days and weeks. And you know, I'm often looking for a story about people navigating challenges and trying to balance often conflicting goals, responsibilities, objectives, and so on. So I'm starting to ramble, so I'll stop there. But thank you all for having me.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to lead with a question. Something you guys said that kind of struck me. Well, there's actually two questions for both Chris and Hoover. One is, how did you first decide? Well, Hoover, I know you've interviewed Marie and you've interviewed me. Why did you decide to reach out to us as opposed to anyone else? So that's the first question. Chris, the question for me, I don't know if you've interviewed Marie, so if the question for Marie applies as well, how did you guys decide to interview us? What brought you to us is one question. And two, either of you can tackle this. How do we know, how does, on this end of things, someone know who your audience is? Because I'm never sure who the audience were. Like USA Today, I got no clue who your audience is. You have an audience, and it's big. So how does one know? And then how did you guys first interact or decide to interview the two of us? Chris, want to start?
Sure. Yeah, so I met you, Akil, through, I believe I was working, it was immediately after the Varsity Blues scandal, right? And so I had, I was kind of in this desperate panic. I had just started at a new publication. You know, to speak to a point that Eric made earlier here, that you know the Chronicle covers higher education, but it's like huge, right? And there are beats within higher education, and you know, if I tried to explain to the layperson, like, yes, I covered higher education, but I don't know anything about admissions. Like that is not something that I'm like terribly familiar with. Like, ask me about free speech, ask me about scooters on campus, or like, you know, like student loans, but like, you know, admissions is a little outside of my depth. And so I remember I'd gotten kind of like a cold pitch email. And sometimes those can be really helpful, especially if they offer a person, you know, especially when there's like breaking news around it and you're kind of like new to the beat and you're just like, okay, well, I'm not sure who to call. Here is a person who can like talk to me in the next hour to 2 hours. Like this is useful. And so I talked to that person and then I just asked them like, who else should I speak to in this world? And your name came up. And so that's kind of how I first talked with you. I remember, you know, we were talking about kind of the world of independent, you know, college consultants, and then that kind of led me to the big pullout that I did about this New Zealand company called Crimson Education, which is, you know, a topic to revisit for another day. But that's kind of how I first came across. You know, you and the way, like, you know, that speaks to the point you made earlier in that, like, you know, it was just a chain of connections. You know, I'm sure if I had like done more Googling, I could have found you directly, but, you know, I didn't know enough to know who I should be looking for. And so like having a starting point and then being like, you know, the fact that you were networked with the people that you were networked, like led me to you. So I think that was like a big part of it. And then as far as Marie goes, you know, I haven't like, I don't know that we've interviewed formally, but like we've definitely talked. And That's thanks to Eric. Like I remember the accept group coming up, and I remember one day being like, okay, I need to diversify my sourcing a little bit, or I want to get ahead of the curve a little bit, and that's kind of how I reached out in that space. So and so I guess for me it's both kind of like there's an element of luck, and that kind of like translates to then who do you know, and are they going to refer you to someone else, and then also just an element of kind of where else you've been, and when reporters are kind of looking for sources, they may not always know what to look for, and so they'll just do like these kind of broad searches. And so I think that was the first part of the question, right? Was there another part? I don't know. I can stop there if that's helpful.
You mentioned a couple of times knowing the beat of a reporter. How does one know?
Yeah. So in the ideal world, the reporter should have a good sense of that. I sometimes don't necessarily know exactly who's on my story or when, but I do try to track my stories after they've kind of gone out in the world, and I look at who's sharing them, where they're being posted, kind of where they're being picked up, and it can be challenging with us sometimes because our stories are they're posted on the USA Today website, but then they're also posted on our sister publications too, and then like there are permutations to the story from there, so it can be a little harder to track, which is to say that like I know that my audience partially consists of the readers at USA Today, but also, the readers at Arizona sometimes, if they were interested in the story that I wrote, and sometimes in Michigan, and, less so in California because we don't have a ton of properties out there. But I think the reporters who are familiar should kind of have a sense for you. And you can also kind of look, there are other clues, right? Like, Politico is going to be read by different people than, say USA Today is, or, like a Wall Street Journal subscription, costs substantially more than, like a Washington Post, digital subscription. So there can be clues in kind of that as well. I think that's a good question, and something that we as reporters should be trying to convey to our sources as well, because it does matter, right? It's your time, and you want to know kind of who you're going to reach by talking to us. So yeah, and I'll wrap there.
Thanks, Chris. To the question of how and why I connected with the two of you. I mean, my path is, every reporter's path is a little different. By the time I met both of you, Akil and Marie, I'd been at this a little while. I met Marie many years ago, and Akil, I met you relatively recently, but no, it's been a while. But I would say my answer is similar, and that is I in some way or another recognized in each of you not just knowledge. A depth of knowledge, when it came to admissions issues, many of which I've talked to Maria about over the years, as well as with you, Akil, and in particular, testing and issues of equity that intersect with pretty much any question you could ask about standardized testing. But it wasn't just your expertise or knowledge. I mean, I would say as a reporter, it was the strong sense. Maria, I think this first came through in-person experience. I saw you on a panel or two. I saw you at an Access conference, where you were there with other members of independent high schools, talking about admissions, and Akil kind of getting a sense of you first, and at least chronologically first, on social media, like what was this dude Akil Bello like on Twitter? But a long way of saying, I recognize in each of you not just expertise, right? Well, many people have some level of expertise, but I will say it was a level of outspokenness, of candor, of context. And I don't just mean, sometimes people ask reporter, and it's a totally reasonable question, like, oh, are you just looking for someone who will give you a great quote, a colorful, vivid, perhaps explosive, dynamic quote? Sure, sometimes we're open. We're all ears, all eyes open for that. But I don't mean that. I don't mean a drive-by, quick, amazing quote. I mean like people who, I think reporters develop a sense of this, people who are willing and able not just to share information, but to share context, nuance, details, make an argument perhaps, and yes, share an opinion. I mean, if there's anything that admissions in particular suffers from, and I would say higher ed in general, it is that many good souls are afraid, nervous about expressing an opinion. I know that's almost a direct echo of a quote from this guy. He's the vice president for enrollment management at Oregon State University. You might have heard of him, John Birkenstock, and you know, but he's said this, he's tweeted this in so many words. Like a lot of people in his field, as he sees it, I hope I'm paraphrasing him accurately, are afraid of expressing opinion, and there may be good reasons for that, right? Not everyone has the freedom to do that at their college campus. But long-winded to answer your question, I recognize in both Akil and Marie a willingness to kind of tell a little more. Talk about the complexity, even if perhaps it's uncomfortable within the realm of admissions and standardized testing. And I think reporters are drawn to that, not because they're looking to just, fill up their stories with incendiary quotes. No, on the contrary, because I think reporters, and particularly all the good reporters I've ever known, are drawn to complexity, candor, nuance, people who can help you understand something. Akil mentioned earlier that, you know, reporters are often looking for information. I mean, that's 100% true. I would add to that, though, that, you know, often reporters are overwhelmed by information, or they feel that, and they're looking for decoders, explainers. Brother, sister, can you help me put this into English in a way that I might understand and help my readers understand, whether they're Chronicle readers or USA Today readers? And so I think that's my long answer to what kind of drew me to both of you and thought, you know, these people are like really interesting and I should talk to them. You know, and I guess the other thing I would say is, you know, I think good reporters are, you know, I try to do this, like strive for complexity and not just simplicity or sound bites. You know, and so I hope that's helpful. I think reporters are often looking for people to explain things that maybe they're not expecting to hear, that challenge their assumptions about things that they know or think that they know. And I'd say the two of you, without going too overboard, are really helpful to me in complicating something that I might start out thinking I really understand, and soon I realize that I need to understand it better.
Thanks. That was super helpful. I'm flattered. I will just put out there, though, for folks, I one time before I got into admissions was terribly impressed with like a really good quote that I gave. Like I was super patting myself on the back, and it was absolutely the wrong thing to say in public to a reporter without telling my boss at the PR firm. And when that hit the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I had a former senator sitting in my cubicle the next day with questions. So be careful, you know, about that. But Akil, along those lines, like I thought that was a really interesting question for the journalist, like how you choose someone. But for you, like let's flip this around. Someone contacts you. How do you decide if it's someone you want to work with? How do you decide if it, yeah, how do you decide? Because I know you turn folks down. I know I do, but how do you make that choice?
I can only recall, well, so there's two things. One is, can I actually contribute? So I almost never say no to taking a call, right? But I'll listen to what the reporter's writing on. And if I'm not the best person, I'll give them my list of people to call next. So I actually literally have a Google Doc with names and emails and I have it sorted. Independent school counselors, IECs, public school counselors. I actually have my list sorted of who I'm referring to next. So I'm not racking my brain every single time to refer to somebody else. So I tend to stay in my zone. And so I won't talk to a reporter if I'm not the best person to answer that question. The only person I've ever turned down was the Epoch Times. I just wasn't comfortable even getting in bed in any sort of way. I like any hopes of that story turning out well just didn't seem like a good move. So that's the only one I ever remember saying explicitly no to. So I generally say yes and try to be helpful. But the thing to be careful is that you never know where the story goes. I also love the phrase on background, and that's a phrase that anyone who talks to a reporter should know, off the record, on background, just know. Recently, the phrase I did tell the reporter, and she said she loved it, but I told her she has to keep it on background. What did I say? I'm fine saying it in a webinar. ACT are bumbling idiots. College boards are evil and mercenary. And she wanted to use that on the record. I was like, yeah, nah. That's essentially how I summarize the two companies. So yeah, I figured I probably wouldn't put that in a newspaper on the record.
That's entirely fair.
Yeah, I figured as much.
Yeah. Gentlemen, there is a question for Chris and for Eric. Just curious about this, about the business of journalism. One of my points was we need to be paying for it. This is a business, right? You all need to get paid. How much do you think about things like clicks and the consumability of a story and the complexity of a story? Like how much of that part do you have to think about it, or does that enter at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, in my experience, I can speak only for my experience at this one publication. There's a growing awareness and attention paid to clicks and reader trends, right? I mean, some of these things can be measured that we didn't used to know. How many people read that story in print in 1985? Unknowable. And now we can know these things. And how long did a reader spend on that article? And did they click through to another article? Has some sense of, did they read it to the end? Which is a concern for me, because often I write stories that are on the longer side, right? And is that worth it? I would say at the Chronicle, we're paying attention to those metrics more than ever, really earnestly, and in hopes of better serving our readers, and particularly now during the COVID crisis, what kind of content related to all the disruption in higher ed seems to most resonate with our readers. Are we paying attention to that? Yes. Are we tracking that in more sophisticated ways than ever? Absolutely. Does that guide and inform discussions of what we might do next? Yes. But does that preclude or snuff out what seems to us in our subjective reasoning and judgment to be a worthwhile story to do on a Monday, or a worthwhile project to invest days, weeks, perhaps months into? No, generally not. And so I feel like that's a happy medium. If we're ignoring these metrics, we're probably ignoring the general habits, wants, whims, wishes of our readers. But if we are making decisions solely based on those metrics, are we realizing journalism to its full potential? No. So I would say on average, reporters are more aware of these metrics and trying to derive some hopefully helpful meaning from them than ever before. But at least at the Chronicle, in our newsroom, it is not shutting down all the things that I think we want reporters to have: curiosity, inclinations to pursue leads, and not be basing decisions on what am I going to write, what am I invested in, what am I really interested in, what stories am I hearing from my own sources that really need to be told. We're not letting all of those important questions be drowned out by merely by metrics, as important as those metrics may be in certain contexts.
Yeah, and to add to that, I don't know that I would necessarily ever write a story with the idea that, like, oh, this is going to deliver me over 100,000 this week, and that's what I need. But that's I'm lucky to be in an environment where I don't have click quotas, and I know people in the industry. I have friends who do, and who do have to produce X amount of stories a week, or do have to get X amount of clicks, or have something tied to their their wage and or, what they do at the paper based on kind of what, how much traffic their stories have gotten in the past. And, I feel really lucky that based on all the papers that I've worked at, that's never been an issue. But, it's something that you're kind of vaguely aware of, or well, sorry, vaguely is the wrong term. It's something that you're aware of, but I try to not put it immediately at the front of my mind, because there are things that like I can't compete with in the USA Today sphere. We cover celebrity news, and I feel that the world of higher education is dear and very important to me. But if I'm going up against Kim Kardashian, I'm going to lose that fight every time. So that's like, I also kind of view it through that lens, and trying to find like a happy balance between like, I have written in this story, it has done well in this space, and hopefully it will continue. That shows enough to kind of the people in my little corner of the newspaper that that people are interested in this, and that it's worth having us around to continue this kind of experiment, or continue this type of coverage, because otherwise, you're kind of coming from a place where you're just like, no, trust me, people are reading. So it is nice to have those kind of numbers to back you up. I would say it also kind of, there are other ways that it may influence the process in a way that maybe it's not necessarily like at the front of my mind, but it's still there. Obviously writing a headline, you want something that will, get people to read the story, right? You've done the work. You hopefully want to present it in such a way that is interesting and actually gets the story out, and actually gets, if you have told an important story about, about a population that's at risk or struggling with something, you want people to not get stuck on the headline and actually get through the rest of it too. So I would say that like in that way, the business kind of, pushes itself into the work, and kind of in the general way where you work in an industry where there are layoffs at kind of at some massive newspaper or company in publishing, kind of on it seems like every 6 months or so. I mean, that just generally socially is kind of tiring, but these are the times we're in, so.
Got a question for either of you, maybe even both. So part of this, as a sort of a lead up to this, is it actually tags on something I've been thinking about. Part of the things that I'm interested in is recognizing, I actually have no idea how journalists work. I know that I have at least 2 stories queued up for Chris. I have 2 or 3 things I've been throwing to Eric for, like, they're like 4 reporters that I've been feeding information for months, if not years, waiting for a story to develop out of it, right? So I think one of the things that's interesting to understand is, one, I think, how does the process work for you? And to tie it specifically to a question in the Q&A, Elena asks, is there a diversity, racism, equity, higher ed story that you'd like to tell but struggle to tell because of the substance of the inputs, quotes, data that you have available? So I think that to me kind of all connects into what's the process of getting a story out? What's the holdup in getting a story out? Specifically, if we frame it in terms of race, equity, and those sort of things.
Wow. Some good questions there. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, right, I mean, if I guess I would have usually at any point like a page of 3 lists, 3 columns, roughly speaking, like kind of near term, midterm, and kind of longer term out there that I'm working on. And so say I'm working on 2 or 3 things on a given day. For one of them, I'm making 3 phone calls. For another one, I'm just sending out some emails, trying to set up some things later in the week. And maybe that third one, that longer term one, I'm reading a scholarly article and trying to figure out like who would I call to have like a long interview about this. And so, and all reporting jobs are different, right? And I'm just talking about mine. But on a given day or a given week, there might be that list of 2 or 3 stories that I'm cranking on, chipping away at, and then, oh gosh, something happens, right? There's a news development. There's a meteor that just came across my line of vision, and like any reporter, I might have to put 1, 2, 3, all 3 of those things on pause and work on that for an hour, a day, 2 days, whatever. And then things get kind of jumbled up, right? And then by the time that list is revisited, maybe I'm constantly making adjustments. I know this is often frustrating to sources who are like, wait a minute, I gave you all this stuff like 2 weeks ago, what happened? I think it's a constant and very messy, not scientific juggling act that often involves an editor or 2 or 3 and trying to figure out like what's the best use of my time. Oh gosh, something just changed in the world. How are we going to prioritize the stories, the assignments on that list? There's things that I've sort of chipped away at for months and months, and then finally I'll decide now I'm going to like dig in and write this. Much to the surprise of people who had written off that interview that he or she had done with me days, weeks, months earlier. And I think it's just a matter of like trying to be, if you have a job where you're working on different kinds of assignments, short, mid, and long range, trying to be timely and trying to respond to the news of the world and the chaos they're in, and while also like chipping away at something that was really important to that reporter, or that the editor and the reporter or the newsroom decided to invest in. And so I guess I would just say like journalists can do a better job of giving people updates who have helped them with reporting projects. I often screw that up and don't do as good a job as that as I should, keeping people kind of in the loop. But sometimes keeping people in the loop means, hey, I know I thought I was going to write this thing like next week, but it might be next month or maybe the month after. I don't know. That's kind of messy, and that's maybe not a very satisfying answer, but I think often that's just I think the conflicting kind of pulls on reporters, generally speaking, to be timely, to respond to things happening in the world today, tonight, while also keeping an eye on the ball of that project that like maybe just a longer investment of time and thought that's just going to unfold over a longer time horizon. How to balance those, I haven't figured it out after 23 years, but I'm trying to get better at it. But sometimes it's just this is how all the balls landed on that day or week.
Just to add to that point, I think we have a great example of kind of like the pressing of a timely event in the form of the coronavirus pandemic and that shifting priorities for a lot of people. Before this kind of had kicked off, or I'm not sure what the correct started or consumed or became all encompassing in our lives. I had been writing about accreditation, especially in the for-profit sector, and I'd been lining up like a project to look a little bit more closely at some institutions that had been accredited by one of the accreditors, and it was going to be like a pretty long, potentially dry project, but hopefully it was one that would return dividends, and I got my editors on board, and everyone seemed to be excited, and March rolled around, and suddenly all there really was we could think about, or all there seemed to be an appetite for was coronavirus, and then the university started sending students home, and it became apparent to me at that point that like, oh, this like pet project that I like have been trying really hard to get my editors on board to do is really going to have to wait a little bit longer. And like eventually I'm getting back to it now, but it's October, and like I had started doing that in February, and so it's sometimes just so hard to tell with it, and I often feel at times conflicted in that I can be very interested in the story, and I can have a sense of the value of it, but you may run into like administrative roadblocks, or there may just be especially for folks working with publications that cover multiple topics. There may be kind of a crowding out of news on any particular day. So even if you talk to someone the day before and they seemed pretty excited about getting something out into the world quickly, You know, if the president catches coronavirus the next day, you know, the appetite for any sort of story that isn't that is going to be lesser, right? And so, you know, those stories may end up paused or stalled a little bit. And so, you know, I feel it much the same way in that I feel guilty when I've talked to someone and I'm not able to turn something around into a story right away. But you know, I was raised Catholic, and if people reach out to me and ask what's going on, I'll be consumed by guilt and kind of get back on it or just reminded of the situation. So yeah.
I gave up guilt for Lent. It's okay to not pick it back up. That's perfect.
Thank you.
I'll just chime in here.
Go ahead, Eric.
Sorry. Pardon me, Akil. I would just, I want to remember Ileana's question about equity. Yeah, I mean, this is not a full or perfect answer, Ileana, but that there's a particular article I've been trying to write off and on for months. And the reason you haven't read it yet is mostly my fault, just scheduling and other articles coming up. But since you asked about race and equity, and I'm sorry, I don't have the question in front of me, but there is an obstacle that I'm encountering, and I'm trying to be thoughtful and delicate about it. And it, I guess the best, I don't want to say too much about the story, but there are some exceptionally vulnerable young people who are vulnerable in large part because of their racial and ethnic background. I think it's fair to say that who are I think are conflicted. They're wanting to tell me their story. They're wanting to tell me more of their story. And to provide some documentation about the challenges they faced, and it seems to me the ways in which their own institutions, that is their colleges and universities, have it's fair to say done them wrong. But they're either still enrolled or wanting to be enrolled once again at those institutions. And as one of them said to me, or messaged me about a week and a half ago, you know, I'm a young person of color, and you're this older white dude, and you're in this position that I'm not in, and I want to tell you my story so that you can write your article, but I'm not sure about how that's going to go, and I have apprehension about that. Again, please understand, I'm not complaining about the situation. It's my job to be patient in many cases. Just in other cases, it's my job to be pushy when I'm perhaps, you know, badgering a college communications office to give me like some detail that I'm insisting that I need. In this case, it is my job to be patient and to be human and as empathetic as I can be, because I think there's a story worth telling. But the obstacle right now is the level of trust and the amount of complexity and chaos in these young people's lives. And it might mean that I never tell their stories, and that would be okay. But I'm trying to be cognizant of the fact that I'm coming from a different part of position, right? And trying to tell the stories of some very vulnerable students of color right now. And it's taken, you know, a little time for them to decide like what they ultimately want to do. So I just mentioned that it's just one very particular example of a story that I thought would have run in like August, that I'm still kind of just in a wait and see mode about. Just goes to the point that every article, particularly articles about students who are vulnerable in any way or maybe in several ways, might be on a relatively slow kind of timeline because there's a lot kind of going on behind the scenes. Hope that made sense.
Yes, I have a question to follow up on that. Do you find that gets easier, that trust level gets easier when there is a counselor or intermediary to bridge that gap for you? I'm thinking of the stories you've done with Paper Cuts in Texas. She has a name. I don't remember her name. She has lots of paper cuts in Texas.
Tara Miller.
Tara Miller. There we go. Tara Miller. Paper Cuts. Tara, hi. So I've seen stories where her students were featured in your story, and I'm wondering if you ever really get that level of trust from a student without the intermediary of a person they already trust telling them to talk to you.
Thank you, Akil. That's a great question. And it really, there's one thing I had on my list here, a short list of like something I really wanted to express tonight to many folks out there who are tuned in, who I think are connected to students in some way and often in a deep way. And that is, short answer to your question, yes, absolutely. That often makes a huge difference, or maybe all the difference possible. Often that person does have a title like school counselor, college access advisor. It's just kind of the way it's worked out in the last 3 or 4 years. Some of the most of the most meaningful articles, at least to me, that I've done have transpired in the state of Texas, and they are all due to the trust, buy-in, curiosity, and by all means patience of a small handful of folks who are connectors. You mentioned the importance of connection earlier in communication, who for me have been, not to put it so crassly, connectors to young people who are in their care, who are in the fold of trust with those counselors or advisors, and that has made an incredible difference. And I would just say this, because these students don't know me. I worked for this newspaper with this long, multi-syllabic name that you can't buy at the store, unlike, Chris's publication. What the hell, who is this guy? And what's the name of his publication? It's a real mouthful. Having the trust and buy-in of that counselor advisor, who has some sense, a clear sense from me, ideally, about why it is that I want to talk to their students whom they care for so much. They're not going to just turn those students over to me lightly, nor should they. And I guess I would just make this point, for lack of a better term. I do think, a couple of articles I've written with the help of Tara Miller in Austin, and certainly with the immense help of Sarah Urquidez at ASP Dallas in Dallas, Texas, over the years. The two of them, just two examples of people who are counselors who and advisors who have helped me connect with students and tell their stories. I do think in some way what they've done when they've agreed to help me is to think of this as a partnership. And I don't mean that I'm giving up my objectivity or my neutrality, for lack of a better word, as a reporter. I have a job to do. It's different from their job. But for some period of time, days, weeks, whatever, we are kind of agreeing to be in this partnership together. And the partnership's goal is to tell a true, first of all, true and accurate story, hopefully in a thoughtful and empathetic way about whatever it is, the challenges of low-income students trying to get to college, or the challenges of students at Stephen F. Austin High School just trying to take a damn ACT or SAT exam over the summer, and they can't do it. And this is stressful. The partnership, I use that term lightly, in asterisks, perhaps quotation marks. Some journalists may not like it, but like for some period of time, if you're telling a certain kind of story, you are in a partnership with someone who's connecting you to young folks who don't have much to gain, perhaps, and a lot to lose by talking to a reporter who might mistreat them. So I think that by partnership, I just mean an investment of time, trust, and consideration to tell a story. And the journalist can't tell a story without help. And the people who are helping that journalist aren't going to feel good about helping that journalist tell a story unless they have some sense of like, what the hell is this guy or gal doing, wanting to talk to my kids for, all the, hours and hours. So I do think journalists should be open to the idea of thinking about what that partnership involves. And it's easy for me to say, but I would encourage people who are connected to young people going through admissions process on the cusp of higher ed to be open to the idea that the right reporter at the right time, it might be very willing to engage in kind of a partnership with you. And it's not just a one-sided kind of transaction, that there's a give and take to information and to trust. So sorry, it's a long answer, but that's what I got.
No, it's perfect. Thank you for that. Because it leads to one of the questions that's in the box actually from Tara. that, I have like kind of a nitty-gritty question for you guys. Earlier, Akil mentioned, background and off the record. I think part of building that partnership, right, is understanding the rules of engagement. Could you all give a little bit of like what those rules of engagement are and what those phrases mean? My assumption always, and this is what I was taught from day one, assume that everything is on the record, assume that it will be attached to your name and your institution, and just be okay with that. And, there are times where I certainly am not as careful as I should be, but I would be really interested in getting, your thoughts about both like the positive changes, but also before we get there, what are those rules? What should we know before stepping in?
I want to say, for perhaps longer than I cared to admit that at the start of my journalism career, I wasn't entirely clear what those rules were. They're kind of used interchangeably between one journalist's background is another journalist's off the record, and so it can be a little hard to know definitively, and so what I try to recommend to people, or what I do when I talk to them, when I am talking to a person in a scenario where there is sensitive information or a fear of information being attributed to a person's name, I always try to first ask, like, what is the concern? If you can explain your concern to me, I'm more likely to be accommodating as far as, if you want to tell me information that you don't want attributed to you, or if you want to tell me something that you feel like I should know, but, it can't be used in the story necessarily. So I think like explaining the fears and trepidation go a long way in kind of helping the reporter help you navigate that, because I do think that there, and perhaps I am revealing my ignorance here, and Eric will call me out on it. But I don't know that that the terms are kind of as hard and fast as you might. I wouldn't say that there's like a book that says like the background is X and off the record is Y, and I know that some reporters for background means perhaps no recording or no taking notes, or for some it's I can use this information but it's attributed to like a senior administration official or something to that effect, and it'll depend on the publication as well. For some publications, and there has to be approval before you can even do anonymous sourcing, and that doesn't come from the reporter themselves. That comes from a power that is like above them both in kind of responsibility and pay grade, and so that's not, if a reporter's like ever tells you like, oh no I don't want to go on off the record or on background or on that sort of, they just may be in a position where they don't feel like they have the autonomy or ability to actually do that themselves. But for me, background, sorry, to get to the point here, when I tell someone that I'm going on background, it generally means that I can use the information they're providing to me, but it doesn't mean that I attribute it to them exactly by name. We may go back and forth on kind of what that attribution looks like, and obviously that would have to be approved by editors and kind of higher up. Off the record is certainly a little bit clearer in that that's not for the record, but it's information that the reporter then has and can kind of use to guide future reporting to get to a place where things will be on the record, and from different sources or in different ways. And again, these will be, what I would, to help navigate that, I would always just ask like the reporter to explain to you, what does that mean to you? Like, what is that? Like, how are you going to protect me in perhaps a vulnerable scenario?
Yeah, I think Chris gave a great explanation. I'm thinking of something I've heard at many higher ed conferences, several admissions conferences in the last few years, and it echoes something you just said a minute ago, Marie. But this is just a fact. I've heard several communications folks from the land of higher ed, stand up in front of a small or large audience and say, in a session about working with the media, and say emphatically, there is no such thing as off the record. There's just not, get it out of your skull. And I'm usually the guy sitting in the, if it's me, probably the back row, just kind of seething, right? Because I'm thinking that's just BS, damn it. There is such thing as off the record, right? There are three modes of communication, generally speaking. As Chris said, and I agree, the lines between them can get blurry, wavy, whatever, but it's pretty, two of them are pretty simple and straightforward. There is on the record. We all know what that means. I'm telling you something, you're writing it down, you're identifying me, John Birkenstock, Vice President for Enrollment Management at Oregon State University, and here's what I said, right? And if John said it, it's probably gonna be really, really smart and colorful. If it's off the record, it's someone telling you, the reporter, something that, like, for whatever reason they feel like you should know, but you cannot publish it, you cannot quote it, and I think people need to know this. You can't even tell someone else about it. It's not just, it doesn't, off the record doesn't just cover publishing the thing that, that source, that person on the other side of the interview told the reporter, but that reporter can't then go to someone else, right? The next person on their interview list and be like, oh, I heard from someone, I won't tell you who, that X is true. No, off the record covers the whole content of the portion of that conversation that was off the record. Now, on background, as Chris said, right, it doesn't always kind of unfold the same way, right? I mean, I might interview Akil, maybe he's heard something about the College Board. He doesn't want to be quoted. I mean, I can't imagine this, but he doesn't want to be quoted saying something about the College Board or whatever entity it is. But there's some information, there's something he's heard or he knows that he thinks would be helpful for me to follow up on, right? Didn't hear it from me, but I'm going to tell you this on background. So I can't quote Akil saying X, Y, Z, but I can follow up on that tip, that shred of information or context that Akil has given me. Now, if I want to quote someone on background, then that is where I think the rubber hits the road. That's where the reporter and the person the reporter's talking with have to be on the same page. Hey, Akil, I might say, what if I wanted to quote you, not by name, but confirming that X was true, or saying, quote unquote, blah, 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 blah. He and I would need to agree verbally, right? Ideally, this is happening on a conversation and not over email or text or whatever. Akil, would you be comfortable saying, blah, blah, blah is true according to what? A test prep expert based in New York? That might be too specific. A person with knowledge of the situation. That's really, really general. Maybe we come to some agreement about the best way to, for me as the reporter, to convey who that person was, not too specifically, but maybe not super vaguely. So I guess I would say, to Chris's point, it's a really crucial point that he just shared. I'll just second it, and that is, don't be shy. Ask the reporter, insist on it, in fact. Hey, look, I just want to make sure we're clear when we, that we agree, that we both agree on what we mean here by saying, I'm telling you, Chris, or I'm telling you, Eric, the following on background. I just want to be clear what on background means here, right? Because, I mean, I can speak for myself, and I know I can vouch for Chris, because I know the guy, but like, not all reporters are the same. And I think that if Chris or I interview you, you can trust us, for real. Not all reporters are the same. They might have different ideas or different experience about what these somewhat slippery terms can mean. Don't be shy. Don't worry about a reporter getting mad at you if you want to say, like, hey, I just want to double check here. No offense, but when we say on background here or off the record here, I just want to clarify what that means. Go ahead and ask that reporter that question. Probably everyone sleeps better in that occasion. So don't be the person who's not asking the reporter questions. I like it when people ask me questions, even if I'm not expecting them, even if I'm sometimes taken aback, like, huh. I think good things happen when sources are able to ask a reporter, like, okay, I just want to double or triple check what you mean, or what you're up to here, Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. Reporter.
So I want to I thank you, because actually I appreciate that check. Here's why. You immediately reminded me in saying that I was trained in the dark arts, right? My reaction that, you know, everything's on the record is because I was trained that relationships with journalists are adversarial, right? And even though I try to check my behavior, because that's not the relationships I've had and worked hard to not have, that deeply ingrained training of coming from that perspective still pops out. So thanks for checking me on that. Because the honest to God truth is, if I said to either of you, this is on background, this is off the record, I have 1,000,000% confidence that you all would honor that and respect that, and we could have that conversation. So thanks for that, because that is, while that was my flippant answer, that is not the truth of how we engage. And so thank you for that.
Can I add to this just real briefly? As far as these rules go, as to Eric's point, there are some reporters who are going to be more hard, kind of, pardon my language, hard asses about what is on and off the record, and there is some kind of, you may encounter people who are like, no, it has to be agreed on both parties, and if you said it was off the record but I didn't, then that means I can use whatever I want, and I don't find that approach necessarily all that useful, because that you get one conversation out of that, whereas you can be, hypothetically be having these conversations over time. But the point that I was trying to make there is that I like to think that a good reporter will always explain these things, but then also do that doubly so when talking to people who are less familiar with the media. So when we're talking about interacting with students or people who are trying to figure their way out and going to college, I give them so much more leniency than I would, not to be playing favorites here, but than dealing with you all folks, just because they're newer to this, they're not as familiar in working with the media, and I always try to tell them, kind of from the get-go, like, look, I'm recording this, but that doesn't mean that like everything you say is on the record or showing up in the newspaper tomorrow, and if you say something or you misspeak, I'm happy to talk to you about that, and we can try to navigate that space a little bit. Obviously I don't do that with like a college president, like they are people who are accustomed to working with the media, or a politician. But with people who are less familiar with it, I do try to give them a little bit more space. And I think, when Eric talks about partnerships and kind of working, trying to gauge in a reporter who you feel comfortable working with, I think that sort of thing is something to look out for, because playing gotcha journalism with young people who are not familiar is not particularly helpful, in my opinion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Chris. I just chime in here quickly. Some colleagues of mine have a really good way of doing this, and I've kind of taken up their lead. And I think of Becky Supiano, my close friend and colleague at the Chronicle. I've never met a more ethical, thorough journalist. I sat next to her for years, and I would hear her saying to students in particular, look, like, just breaking it down. I want to talk to you in a way that I can quote you and use your words, and put them in my article that will appear on the internet, right? I mean, it sounds kind of maybe to some ears like, kind of elementary, but I think a journalist has to be willing to do that. But the other side of that coin is the people who are deciding, like, do I want to connect this student that I really know and maybe love, right? And feel a connection with a deep connection with and a responsibility for, do I want to connect with that reporter? Tell those students that same thing. Like, this reporter is going to interview you, and his or her article, very well might include your name and some thoughts from you. So you should think about that, young person. Like, what are some things you're comfortable sharing and maybe not so comfortable sharing, and empower them to do that. I mean, easier said than done, easy for a journalist to say, but I feel like those conversations go better when people have maybe not coached a young person, but prepared them for like what this is like. I'm constantly interviewing people, and I usually ask young women and young men this question: have you ever been interviewed by a reporter before? And usually the answer is no. And I don't take that lightly, but I think the person who's connected that young, those young folks with me, can if they chime in a little to give that student a sense of what to expect. I usually find that helpful. I would never object to that at all. So.
So there's a question in the chat, which I think ties into this nicely. David asks, I'm just going to read it. I think it's tough, risky to challenge or criticize a behemoth like College Board, ACT, NACAC, or an Ivy, your State Department of Ed, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess the question here, and he goes on a little bit. Let me just see if I can get to the question part of this. Right. To me, the question is, how does, and David, if I'm wrong, please correct me. How does someone who's at a school, at a district, at a college engage with you as a reporter to tell a story when they can't be particularly on the record? And I think we've largely answered that in terms of you just may have to be off the record. I think I would also answer that a little bit in terms of, and I think it's for me, I send reporters stuff all the time. Like I'll Chris, I want you to look at this. Like, and I tell you, I've got 3 Google Docs with Chris's names on them that I think he would like the story. I don't know if he can write them, but I think he would like it. And you have to be okay with reporters not picking it up, and B, be okay shopping it around after you've given them a chance to pick it up. So I think that to get to David's sort of question, do you guys, as the reporters in the room, have any particular suggestions beside on the record, off the record, which we've kind of discussed, around how those who aren't in a position to risk their jobs can engage with you around stories, specifically those that address the big boys in the room?
Yeah, great question, Akil. Thank you, David, for the question. I appreciate you asking it. I guess I would just say this is not a perfect answer by any means, but I've said this before, and it's true. I mean, it's been true in my experience as a journalist. It's the only thing I've ever done. There are many ways to help a reporter, to guide a reporter to information that's concerning to you that you feel is important, to other humans who may be able to help that reporter indirectly or directly. I mean, this is the truth. There are a handful of people, a couple of handfuls of people who have helped me do my job at the Chronicle for many years, whom I've never quoted, or have only very, very rarely occasionally quoted. Their names have generally not ended up in stories that say by Eric Hoover at the top. Just as there are people who I've quoted numerous times, perhaps too many times, right? They help me by giving me a quote, by sharing their thoughts. That's great. But that is just one flavor, right? Or one example or one facet of a way that some person with knowledge, maybe it's you, David, a concern, a firsthand glimpse of a trend or a concerning development or a problem or a challenge or a shortcoming on behalf of whatever, that you could bring that to a reporter's attention. It relates back to the conversation we were just having, which might sound kind of nerdy and nitty gritty, but like there are rules, maybe not always, totally agreed upon, but there are general rules of engagement, if you will. I hate that term, for interacting with a reporter. And saying like, look, I cannot be quoted, I cannot be on the record criticizing XYZ, but I wanted to bring XYZ to your attention. Here's a document. Here's an email that might help you understand. I'm willing to talk with you off the record, or perhaps on background if we agree on what that is, about this thing that's prompted me to reach out to you, Eric, or to you, Chris, and some hope of you writing an article or inquiring into this problem or thing that's concerning you or pissing you off, to reach out to that reporter. And yeah, maybe that person's name is never in any article that's published anywhere, but sometimes those people can be the most helpful folks in terms of getting the ball rolling, a journalist's wheels turning to look into something that turns into a 2-day news story or a 6-month investigation or something in between. So I guess I've talked to people after the fact who said, oh, I thought it had to be like this big outspoken quote monster to talk with you. And if I were not that, or was not in a position where I felt like I could be that because of my job or other considerations, then I just thought you would have no interest in me, in so many words. And I've tried to tell people again and again, no, that's that's not true. You read people who are quoted in my stories, but there might be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other people in a given story who were gatekeepers to information, connectors to information, or to other humans with something to tell me. So I guess I would just say, don't be shy, even if you think like, I just cannot be like quoted saying, you know, X, Y, and Z entity is like doing this awful thing. You can tell me a little bit about that, even if you can't be quoted, you know, on the record in a story. I think lots of potentially helpful people in the world just don't know that or haven't experienced that fact, when they deal with journalists.
Yeah, and I would say to that end, you know, that even if I don't, you know, even if I am quoting you by name, or you know, for some reason you know, you don't want to be in the final piece by name, I think every person I talk to informs the story in some way, shape, or form. It helps me understand the reality of the situation. And you know, it's hard with that without looking at a story immediately in front of me. But you know, there are often a lot of lines in reporters' stories that you know, are just kind of laying the landscape of a particular situation, and those kind of like landscape, you know, or laying the grounds paragraphs are informed by the people that they've talked to. You know, in the ideal world, these are backed up by interviews and context, and you know, we're not just making them up as we go along. So I always find that helpful in just making, you know, even as a gut check, you know, just being like, I am seeing this thing and I need someone to tell me if it's what I think it is, you know, or if I'm if I'm misunderstanding this like crucial part of it, or if there's actually more going on there. And then just as it relates to, you know, the kind of quotation piece, I mean, if you personally feel like that you are not the person, or you don't want to be in the spotlight in that way, chances are you are probably more familiar with your community or your field than I am, and you know the person who might be willing to speak out in kind of that big outspoken way, or you know, who you can point me in the right direction. You know, I find that is always helpful, and especially you know, sometimes it's a big world out there and you just need someone to tell you which way to go, especially as a reporter. So
I also want to point out a couple of things. Marie, did you talk to the Forbes lady who quoted, I don't remember her name right now. Okay, so there's an article in Forbes that came out maybe last week that she actually says in the very beginning of her story, she spoke to 75 people to write the story. I was one of the 75, I'm not quoted. Marie was one of the 75, she's not quoted, right? That, I think, is a really good example of how a lot of journalism happens. Also, I have a Twitter thread, I will send the link to it somewhere, of a story that came out recently that featured Tara Miller. And Tara's quoted, I'm not. I sent them to Tara, so I will never send anybody to Tara again. Kidding. But what I found interesting about the story is it was good to see fingerprints on it that I knew were mine, even though I wasn't in it. So I think you have to be ready for that, and that's often how these stories come together. And I think those two stories are really good examples of places where people will talk to reporters and so it's not necessarily a quote out of it. Now, I think if you're running a business, that runs a whole different conversation. I think we're sort of focusing this on more education. But I think if you're running a business, you're an IEC, you may want the quote at all times because that's good for business. That is certainly a different perspective than a lot of kind of what we're presenting here, which is more about getting higher ed stories out there. Someone mentioned, I think Chris mentioned earlier, getting pitches. I'm sure Chris and we don't have time for it tonight, but I'm sure Chris and Eric can tell us, you know, chapter and verse of the pitches they get from marketing people, from test prep companies every single day. You know, I've had a couple of reporters, you know, ping me, say, hey, I've seen this pitch. Is this person crazy? So that's an entirely different approach to media than I think educators and counselors will tend to take. And I think that there's some value in that, because clearly if it helps your business grow, there's value. But I think you have to figure out where you want to engage with reporters and then operate from that perspective.
I did contact Hoover one time with a pitch recently where I said, there's this amazing show on HBO that's featuring an admissions person dressed in drag. and you need to write this story. And he was like, what? And I'm like, watch it. I promise you. So that was one time I can recall like really actively pitching Eric on something like this. But
And that became a story, right?
Hmm?
That did become a story, didn't it?
A good one.
It did, and that just reminds me real quick. I mean, often I probably have written stories on 5%. I mean, a tiny percentage of pitches I've ever received. But sometimes, pitches I think often go wrong in my opinion, because they're wanting me to write about the very, 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 very end result of something. I just got one today. Such and such college's class is 15% more racially and ethnic diverse than it was last year. I mean, I thought, cool. I don't know. I haven't contacted them, but I've gotten a million pitches like that. And it's like, often, occasionally I've asked, can we talk about what it was like to get there? What was the challenge, deficit, problem, shortcoming, shortfall that prompted you to do X, Y, and Z to get that better result? Oh, no, we don't want to talk about that because I'm paraphrasing. That would be admitting that we weren't perfect before and that we had made mistakes in the past and that we weren't doing enough to get this result that we cared about. Those pitches to me are forgettable. One thing that often does work in a sense is, hey, Eric, I'm pitching you this person. He or she is interesting for these reasons. Here are things that he or she has been wrestling with, whether it's a college president or enrollment vice president or admissions dean or whatever. And here are some things that he or she is passionate about, worried about, concerned about. So I'm not being pitched a story to then go kind of dutifully go and write that probably is meant to make that college look good, but is pitching just this person, this smart, engaged, often passionate person who's wrestling with something. Often those pitches I think are successful because they lead me sometimes in a month or a year or whatever to bring that person into articles I'm writing about trends where he or she might be quoted. And then over time, he or she tells me about something that he or she has done on that campus or something that's happened on that campus. And that's kind of like a long, slow process. But I do think pitches that are about like, hey, look, I just want to connect you with this person. Here's why you might find him or her interesting. I find those pitches in general more interesting than, hey, come write about our success, our very end result that we really are so excited about.
I think we have time for one final question, and then we'll wrap up. Eva asks, are you aware of what other reporters in higher ed are working on, or do you work in silos? Is it competitive to assume or assume that multiple outlets will cover the same story? I think that's an interesting question. Why don't we start quickly with Chris, because I think that you two will have very different answers.
Yes, I'm painfully aware of what other people are working on, especially when they have written a story that I was hoping to write before them. No, but I think it, as far as whether or not that affects kind of what story we end up writing, I think it depends on the story and the situation. I have a good example of this recently. USA Today was working on a story about coronavirus rates in college counties, and the New York Times apparently was working on a story at the same time that published about, I would say, 2 days ahead of the deadline that I had given myself. And so that can be kind of deflating a little bit, but the idea being that I think for reporters, we try to remind ourselves that, we serve different audiences, they take slightly different approaches and try to kind of come at the questions in a different sort of way. I think perhaps when I was when I first started in journalism, I perhaps overestimated how valuable a scoop might be. I think certainly there are scoops that are really valuable in that sort of thing, but I feel less like that is the thing that motivates me the most. I think the the idea behind a scoop, bringing something unique and unusual to your audience is valuable, even if the topic is something that multiple people are writing about. And there are some things that that are just so newsworthy that other people are going to write about them kind of no matter what. I mentioned it once earlier, but the Varsity Blues scandal, right? I mean, when that was kind of like bubbling up, I knew that everyone in the higher ed space was going to be writing about it. And from another perspective too, like I'm a daily reader of the Chronicle. Like I look to what's being reported there and kind of what's being said in that space, and I also try to read all the other higher ed reporters that I can to try to keep myself kind of abreast of what's going on. But I hope that answers the question. I would like to think that most higher ed reporters and most reporters generally are kind of aware that they are just one reporter at one outlet in a country full of newspapers of varying size and scope. So.
Yeah, I mean, a great question, Ava. Yeah, I mean, I think often we, there aren't that many, Chris's point, there are many education reporters, just not as many as there used to be. And I would say not as many as I wish there were or should be. I think generally when it comes to bigger trends or news developments, we have a sense, because we know or we see something on Twitter, maybe what one or more other higher ed reporters are working on a given day or week. And then there's just some general trends and contours and themes that we can probably guess that so-and-so at these three other publications, Kick-Ass Reporters is working on that week. But then it's constantly surprising. Like, oh gosh, look, Melissa Korn just did this story. Wow, that's really cool. Wish I'd written it. Look how good it is. But I think to Chris's point, like scoops matter in certain ways, like it's at least sometimes. But I do think there's all different kinds of scoops. There's I'm the very first reporter to report that X just happened, or that X happened a year ago, and now I just dug it up and tell you about it. But there's other ways of measuring the impact of a story. Like there's a conceptual, contextual kind of scoop, right? Maybe I wasn't the first to report this news, but I'm going to tell you something about one piece of it that you really need to know. And that's a particularly acute question for the Chronicle and the Chronicle's audience. Like, sure, if we want to break news when we can, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And but if a story is important, like we're going to be asking, chewing over the question of like, okay, what's our investment in this? Say it's a big breaking news story. What are we going to give readers that's a little bit different? I mean, all newspapers ask that question. What best fits our audience? Maybe that's a different answer than what best fits. What's the best version of that story for USA Today audiences? But I think there's a diversity in publications that I think is a strength, and that's gonna inform like what is the best version of this story. Sometimes it's a scoop. Sometimes it's just like, man, we didn't have that scoop, but our follow-up story on day 2 or 3 is going to be kick-ass. What do we mean by that? Let's get together and figure out what that is, and what that is not, and how we execute that story.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up with one last question because I'm curious. Anything that you wanted to say that we didn't cover tonight? Anything that you want to push back or just hints, anything at all that you want to throw out there? All three of you.
Nothing for me. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think that it's interesting. And I think that the big thing for me, I guess, is to engage with reporters in order to help get stories out, whether there's a return for you specifically or not. And that's the best that we can do.
I want to just the hope in sitting down with you all is hopefully to help ease the trepidation in talking to reporters if there is a concern there. As we were talking about earlier, I think it's hugely valuable to talk to people without the expectation of that they'll be quoted in a piece, and I think for a lot of reporters, they're all trying to do that to some degree, and so I just hope my hope is that I've been able to share that with you all, and hopefully, if you are interested in talking to a national reporter at USA Today about higher education, I'm certainly available to do that as well. But I think that the main takeaway that I was hoping to kind of convey is that, I would say that a lot of reporters are not just looking to, harvest your sources and kind of move on. I think for a lot of people there is a lot of care and attention, and I always feel really honored when someone connects me with a student and gives me a chance to kind of explore their story and present it to people who may have not have heard it otherwise. So thank you.
Yeah, just if I could just trail off on that point, Chris, and I think it's a great one. Thank you. Yeah, there's often this kind of veil of mystery about journalists and journalism and how it all goes down, and I totally understand that and am aware of that. But to Chris's point, often journalists don't know what they're doing. And look, I'm not insulting my colleagues or myself, I don't think, but I do think I've encountered this in my 2 decades of being a journalist. Like, there's often a sense that journalists always have this angle, they're always running some scheme. They know their next 3 steps, they knew the next 5 moves on the board. I'm here to tell you that that's often not the case. I often wake up or log back in after a lunch break and think, okay, what am I doing? And I might have like a head full of questions or things that I'm curious about or feel really strongly like I want to learn more about, but I don't exactly know what I'm doing. And so what do I depend on? What do I reach out to? What does it all come down to? Is it some like scheme in my head? No. Is it some list of 17 like awesome killer questions that I've got in a notebook? No, it's not. It's so often relationships with people I've known for a week or 10 years or more. And sometimes those relationships can be weird and complicated and we might argue, but I think so much of journalism, more than some people might expect or guess, comes down to a whole bunch of different kinds of relationships that reporter has and hopefully is trying to cultivate and nurture with a whole bunch of different kinds of people. We call them sources, right? They're just people. And I think that without those relationships, short-term, long-term, everything in between that I've had, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be writing any interesting stories. And I think that, again, to echoing something I said and a few things Chris has said earlier, there's all kinds of different ways to have some kind of connection, rapport, relationship, whatever, communication with a higher ed journalist. And so I would just leave you with that thought because I think it's important.
That is perfect. Thank you. Cheers to all of you. Thank you for spending time with us tonight. I hope that we hit all the bingo cards that I know some folks made. We'll post this onto YouTube. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. I hope we found this interesting, fun, exciting. I lived up to all of the dreams. Anyhow, thanks for joining us tonight.
I was asked about my dog. There he is. He was patiently waiting. Say bye, Luke.
Bye, Luke.
Hoover, what is the skull? What's the skull?
We have a drawer full of Halloween decorations. I didn't want to say we have a drawer full of skulls here on D Street, but tis the season, so there's multiple skulls floating around our dining room here. So that I just thought one of them should be perched as we get closer to a very strange Halloween.
Thank you, friends. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.